All right, welcome back to the Casthammer, or should I say welcome to our new episode 1, version 2.0 of Casthammer. I am ItalianSpartacus, and alongside me is Loremaster of Sotek, a confirmed Loremaster of Age of Sigmar now, right?
Yeah, I got promoted.
You at the Citadel in Texas, is that what it is?
Yes, it's for a community-run league series, but I've been keeping up with the lore for everybody while also writing the lore for my night haunts, and apparently it was good enough that I got a piece of paper for it, so that's great.
Well, now you have it right there. I mean, obviously it's like a diploma. So, taking a look at Loremaster and myself, and this is your first time, kind of for our first foray into discussing things or seeing how we discuss things. Sotek and I have been playing Warhammer for 20 plus years. I've played Warhammer Fantasy, but mainly 40k. And I'd say, Sotek, you've played mainly Fantasy and less 40k, would you say?
I would say I've played 90% Fantasy, 5 to 10% 40k.
Okay, that's a fair assessment. I think that, and I would say I'm more like 60-40. I played more 40k games than I did fantasy games, but I think I consumed a lot of fantasy lore in the time. But
I would say I've gotten to the point where I can comfortably, someone could say, hey, you want to play 40k? And I could sit down, make a Tyranid list in 10 minutes and play a game. So it's a lot better than it used to be.
And just sweat through the whole thing.
Oh, absolutely.
And again, we do run YouTube channels. Obviously, you're turning into mine here, ItalianSpartacus, but Loremaster of Sotek has his own YouTube channel as well. You'll always find that linked in the description and comments anytime we put up a Casthammer. And you can see these up hopefully every week. That's what we're trying to do as far as a set weekly or every other week update for these things. So you can hope to see those on the channel. But what is the Casthammer? What does it include? So what we really hope to accomplish with this podcast is covering a lot of different subjects across really all three of the primary IPs of Games Workshop. Warhammer Age of Sigmar, Warhammer 40,000, and then the now defunct but now coming back Warhammer Fantasy Battles, or soon to be called Warhammer the Old World.
Yeah, they barely let the body cool off, didn't they?
Yeah, seriously, like, huh? It's not smelling anymore? All right, boot that bad boy up.
Take him out!
Take him out! It's been 6 feet. But we'll be covering the hobby as a whole. We'll be covering lore from the hobby. We'll be covering news from the hobby. So pretty much anything that we can really sink our teeth into as far as discussing in a long form format, either again, the lore, a big news update like, oh man, Games Workshop has decided to sell all its subsidiaries and it's just going to become a quilt shop. I don't think that's ever going to happen. But anything that we can really dive deep on, that's what we're going to do. And that's the subject of this podcast. But we also want to have a heavy community interaction. So, tell us a little bit more about that heavy community interaction.
Yeah, so probably the best part of the Warhammer hobby, and the reason so many people get into it, is that unlike many hobbies that are tabletop, it has broadened into, a global community. And the community is the best part of it. As much as I have enjoyed Age of Sigmar, I came to genuinely fall in love with it once I started getting in to start playing games again and like talking to people and being able to show off my models and paint and kit bash and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why a lot of people come to our channels, is because they start playing the video games and then they find the channel and they start learning about the lore, and the next thing they know, they're buying models and they're playing on Tabletop Simulator against people, and it just keeps going.
Right.
So we want to encourage that on here. And so what we mean by that is we want to have ways for y'all who are listening to actually get to interact through like the podcast. So we were thinking of, we have our setting up we'll have it set up by the time this airs, a place where you can submit content that y'all yourselves have done that we can feature on here, and tell everybody who you are and where you submitted it, and talk about what we love about it, whether it's you drew a picture of your favorite character, or you painted a model that you're really proud of, or maybe you are going to a tournament and you made like a diorama for your army to stand on. It looks really good. Or maybe you just wrote a fan story about your army in a league you're in, stuff like that.
Yeah. I think it'll be cool too because a lot of people will have heavy interaction. They'll see themselves showcase. It's just like when you watch like the Critical Role streams on Twitch. They always showcase some of the artwork that people do during the breaks or the ends of the show. So we kind of hope to do the same thing there to kind of create a community around this. So with that all being said, we're about to jump into our first subject. But before we do, I would like to give a special little announcement here to a very special little boy who just had his birthday. Loremaster of Sotek himself just had his 311th birthday. Isn't that what it is?
I think somebody like tried to quote accurate Warhammer numbers at me, and I'm like, I'm too lazy to like try and look any of this up.
I refuse. But for his birthday, as I press all these buttons right now, I'm sending him a digital gift voucher for Games Workshop. So
you didn't need to do that.
I did though, Pookie Bear. So I hope I hope you go buy a lot more. What the hell is I'm thinking of? Night Haunts or maybe even some more.
Dude, Terrifier are about to come out. Night Haunts are going on the back burner real soon.
More importantly, Lumineth Realm Lord is about to come out, but that's for another episode. But
oh, God,
related to that,
yeah, sorry. Not today.
Well, we'll get into that, though. We'll get into that. But related to that, though, our first big lore subject for today is going to be the War of the Beard. Who won? And that's a big debate back and forth, right? Like, oh, it's clear the dwarfs, they killed Calidor II. Oh, it was clearly the High Elves because they lasted through so many sieges and they didn't really lose. Like, there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of back and forth sentiment, and a lot of like harsh sentiment, depending on which side of the fence you fall on. So we're going to discuss those two, and we're not going to take a stance either way. We're going to discuss, okay, what about the High Elves? What are some of their natural advantages, their disadvantages? What was the ultimate result of the war for them and their society and their quote unquote empire? And the same thing for the Karazhan Corps. We're going to discuss that for the dwarfs, and then you guys can decide. What did you think after hearing these things? Do you think that it truly was the dwarfs that won? Or do you think it truly was the elves that won? And we'll do a poll during the week to decide who ultimately won that we'll announce in the next episode. So, yeah. Sotek. High Elves. Yeah. War of the Beard. Okay. Thoughts?
Okay, so looking at the war... Now, the War of the Beard obviously can be set up into different eras, so to speak, because there are moments where one side kind of came out on top,
right?
But we're mainly, when we do the vote, it'll be for the overall winner,
right?
Because we don't want to stop at. There were some moments where each side kind of ended on a strong point. When Calidor II killed Gotrek Starbreaker's son, that was a pretty big deal.
His name was Snorri Halfhand, for those wondering.
Yeah, losing the High King's son to the Phoenix King was a pretty grievous blow to the elves. But then the elves got done back when Morgrim, who got the name Elf Doom for his achievements, managed to kill Immeldrake, who was one of the nastiest, strongest dragon lords of Ulthuan at the time.
Right.
But I think the big thing for the High Elves that's worth noting is that for strengths, I would say the biggest strength in their favor as far as saying that they won was that ultimately this was a colonial war for them.
Right.
The High Elves didn't commit their full strategic might at any point during the War of the Beard.
Correct.
Because by the time the war got ugly enough that basically all of Ulthuan was empty to attack the dwarves, Malekith immediately jumped in.
Right.
Because that was the whole reason the war started in the first place, was of course Malekith manipulating the two factions against each other.
And I guess that's a good point to say real quick, is that for those of you who don't know what the War of the Beard is, I'm referring to the High Elf name for it, the War of the Beard. The dwarves call it the War of Vengeance. And just to real quick high level synopsis is that Malekith attacked a dwarf. It was a trading party, I believe, right?
Yeah, it was a numerous amount of caravans that got like wiped out.
Yeah, it was
mysteriously.
And with evidence of High Elf remains left by the Dark Elves. And Malekith again is the leader of the Dark Elves, having seceded from Ulthuan in a bitter civil war called the Sundering. But This ultimately embroils in a conflict between the dwarfs and the high elves that results in the war itself. And the ending of the war is when Calor II is killed by High King Gotrek, and he takes the Phoenix Crown. And that kind of ends the war, but at the same time, it's also when Malekith comes back to Ulthuan and attacks. So it's more of like, all right, well, we'll stop this for now. So now that you guys, I guess, have a high-level overview, and I agree with you. I totally agree with you that, like, the High Elves don't really have a lot of skin in this game because they don't really have a ton of investiture, because the majority of it's all in Ulthuan or over down in the two Tower of the Sun, Tower of the Moon, whatever it's called.
Oh yeah, they've got all sorts of rings of defenses. The most famous two are the towers, but they also have a couple of, like, citadels and stuff.
Right. I mean, they're spread all over the globe at this point. And the Karazankor, which is the Dwarf Empire, is pretty much in every single mountain range on the eastern continent, not the western one, obviously.
Yeah. Plus, we had the Skarmanari during that time, which were the hill dwarves. So they're like where you now see, like, empire cities,
right?
Like Midland Middenheim, or like many imperial cities, and were actually originally dwarf cities, just like many of the now famous Bretonnian castles and kingdoms are situated on the remains of high elf cities.
For instance, Liangui is a former Toralessi, correct? Or is that a Corona I'm thinking of?
No, I think you're right.
Yeah, and Toralessi is pretty much the center place of the War of the Beard. I mean, the dwarfs siege it 14 times. This is before the time that dwarfs have gunpowder. They're using crossbows, essentially, and sappers against an army filled with dragon-riding high elf archers and dragon princes. So it's kind of stacked against them. Go ahead.
And that's of course another big strength for the high elves is they had dragons.
Yeah,
lots of dragons.
Tons.
I mean, the dragons had not gone crazy to sleep yet.
Yeah,
because one thing that is worth knowing about the high elves in the modern age is many of the dragons are gone or have basically gone into a sleep that they won't awaken from until the end times or ever. And they were kind of at their height. Both empires were at the height of their power when this war started. But the elves had dragons. They had people. They were a global power as opposed to the dwarves just being the dominant power of the old world, which, granted, the old world is the largest continent on the planet.
Right.
But, or at least the most important, because the dwarves, of course, stretched all the way down into the Southlands and stuff.
And over into the Badlands. Because I don't know, when does the Chaos Dwarfs timeline begin? I believe it's after this, right?
So the Chaos Dwarves existed at this point, but I'm not even sure they had made contact with the dwarves yet. Because the Chaos Dwarves popped up relatively just before the Vortex was created.
Oh, so at the time of the Great Catastrophe?
Yeah, because they got cut off because of chaos coming into the world.
Oh, I thought they were cut off because of this, when they're kind of like, oh, Karazankor is diminishing.
No, the big thing that occurs as a result of this is that the dwarves focus so much on the Western War that their Eastern defenses started to fracture. And then, of course, the Great Earthquake happens and the Goblin Wars happen. And the dwarves were not ready for it because they just finished fighting a big old war.
Right.
But to finish up the High Elf strengths, I would probably say dragons, much superior navy, way superior navy. Granted, the dwarves
a navy, period.
It's like, granted, dwarves don't give two craps about naval routes, but like Barak Var had a really hard time during the Elven War. And so you have your naval force, you have dragons, which basically meant air superiority. And this is before, ItalianSpartacus is right. This is before gunpowder was really well accepted. This war actually had a big lead up into why black powder became such a big deal, is because black powder weapons were dragon killers. And then you had, but this is before gyrocopters. This is before organ guns. This is before, the most sophisticated black powder weapons the dwarves had at this point were like cannons, which were very rare, and thunderers, handguns, which were very rare.
Right.
But I think, and then I guess they had magic, but of course that was countered well by the dwarves.
Yeah, I mean, elves do have magic, but yeah, dwarves have that innate resistance to it. But I mean, you kind of like, you think about it, right? You think about, there's 14 separate sieges of Toralessi. This is the main center point of the War of the Beard. And they didn't win the siege of Torlesi. They just killed Calidor II, took his crown, and ran away. So, were they really successful in doing anything? Like, I mean, taking a look at the result of the War of the Beard on the High Elf side. We'll talk about the Dwarves when we get to their strengths, advantages, and everything like that. Looking at the result, I mean, you now have a nation that is about to jump into a second incursion, right, from Malekith. And the death of Calidor II, the current Phoenix King, who Sotek and I both agree is just an asshole.
The worst.
The worst human or elf.
Calidor II, there's an entire page in, oh gosh, I want to say it's
Starbreaker. I know what book you're talking about.
Yeah, there's a page with like full artwork of him, but it has an entire page dedicated to all his nicknames that the High Elves gave him.
Yep.
Not the dwarves, the High Elves, and they are not nice.
Yeah.
I mean, the nicest name for him is Calidor the Arrogant.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and he is the son of Calidor the Conqueror, and Calidor the Conqueror is this amazing Phoenix King with all these awesome this awesome legacy behind him. He kind of creates
one of the best Phoenix
Kings. Easily. He's really the third Phoenix King after Anarion, and he creates the legacy of militia and a militarized constant force for the High Elves that it really kind of becomes the blueprint of their society today. And Calidor II is this Ponzi hairdresser who is just an asshole of a man, or elf again, and his like official title on like the grand scroll of all the Phoenix Kings is Calidor II, the Warrior. And that's really more of like a personal jab. He thought he was this amazing fighter like his dad was, but he really wasn't. He was all into decadence and just having these like soirees and really leaving the fighting to his generals. Like, he only showed up for the 14th war of or the 14th siege because like it was pretty much a surefire win. Like, it was a full committal of elf forces, correct?
Right. So early on in the War of the Beard, what led up to him killing the High King was that he believed he was amazing, which to his credit, he was a very good duelist. But like, he was so arrogant that he couldn't even get a dragon to take him as a rider.
Right.
Because the dragons hated him because he didn't respect them. When he fought Snorri Halfhand, it was basically Snorri just kind of really underestimated him because Snorri thought elves were all just very weak, and although they were fast, he can make up for it with skill, and he just did not properly give Calidor's skill the respect it deserved. Plus, Calidor, being the Phoenix King, he had the nicest magic equipment crafted by the elves, who, you know, elven magical weaponry is on par with dwarven rune weaponry. It, you know, there's a lot of debate about which is technically better, but they're equal. And because of that, Snorri was killed by him, and Calidor thought, okay, I've killed like supposedly the greatest warrior besides the High King himself. It was easy. I'm going to go back to home because clearly I'm not needed here and this is a waste of my time. So he left, and he didn't come back until the 14th siege when things got really ugly. And it should be noted that for the well, you're right, we'll get to that in the dwarf part, but for the elves, when he came back, Calidor was, once again, his arrogance was his undoing. Calidor sailed really far ahead of his own fleet,
right?
Because he had the nicest ship, being the Phoenix King. And elven ships, their classifications are significant, and they have many different classes of ships. Some are larger, but the greatest ships, which are typically referred to as dragon ships, are freakishly fast, despite their size. And he got there so quick that he showed up in time for the siege, but he left a significant portion of his army behind.
Right.
So he had all of his elite soldiers, sure. But in the final siege, when the High King himself showed up, Calidor II didn't have any dragons for reasons we'll get into in a minute. And he also was missing probably 50 to 60% of his actual army. Now, what he had with him was, of course, his personal guard and, you know, all the people defending, like the natives, who are all very skilled and stuff. But that ended up screwing him over in the end, was that he was so underpowered that he ended up dying in his duel against Gotrek before his army even showed up.
Yeah, before they could get the upper hand. And I mean, it's easy to kind of look at like, okay, this is just a conflict over at Tor Alessi, but really this, I mean, the War of the Beards spans the entirety of the old world. I mean, there's the Great Siege of Karak Azul, you know, where Brock Stonefist, kind of the Nightmare of the Deeps, rallies the dwarfs against the High Elves, and you have this really awesome, I guess you could say, grudge match or a constant fight between Lord Salindor. And you have a lot of these really big pivotal battles, and it's
those two ended up killing each other.
Yeah, they fight to the death in a burning town that's like fleeing.
Yep. And they both died.
Yeah, the Battle of Blind River.
They were both too full of hate and stubbornness to turn around.
Yeah, like I love it. It's really cool because I think what I like about the War of the Beards so much is it's that kind of like histrionic, sweeping, poetic history in the same way that Robert's Rebellion is in George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones. It's, Rhaegar fell at the Trident, and his rubies from his chestplate that were shattered by Robert Baratheon are still in the Trident to this day. Like, you get all of these kind of really sweeping moments, like you were talking about with Drowcane, or Drowcane? What's his name? The Caledonian Prince. You just mentioned him.
Immeldrick.
Wrong guy. Drowcane's his dragon.
Yes. I was like, you're saying a dragon name.
Yeah, I know. I was like, wait a minute. But you get a lot of these really big, larger than life characters. Morgrim and Immeldrick, Salindor and Brock Stonefist, and which are also really like ham-fisty fantasy names. But really what you're seeing is two superpowers grinding each other to dust. I mean, this is a centuries-long conflict. This isn't just over the span of like 4 years. Like, it's not that at all.
Oh, yeah, no. These races are so long-lived. Dwarves on average are going to live for 300 plus years. Elves live for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
And they had been, one of my favorite things about this war, that some fantasy universes have it, but I think Warhammer has done it the best from what I've seen, is that these guys were the biggest allies for so long. Like, they pushed chaos out of the world.
Right.
They pushed the Greenskins out. They pushed the Warriors of Chaos out, or what existed of them at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
They wiped out the demons. Like, they purged the Beastmen. Like, they cleaned up the entire planet that they could get to.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, Malekith being close to both of their hearts because he was the first dwarf friend ever.
Yes.
Much less an elf. Like, he was best friends with the first High King and was there at, like, when High King Snorri Whitebeard died, the person at his bedside with him was Malekith.
And he promised, Malekith promised that the dwarfs and the High Elves, or the dwarfs and the elves, would always be friends. And that's when, like...
And then, of course, Malekith totally pulled a Malekith. But,
yeah.
But like, this war, when it started, even both sides were really not super into it.
Mm-hmm.
Because there were factions. Like, you had High King Gotrek Starbreaker did not want to fight the elves.
Right.
He literally refused to fight them for the first for at least the first 40 or 50 years into the war.
Mm-hmm.
And the same goes for Immeldrick. Immeldrick and Morgrim, the dwarf who became known as Elfdoom and who later killed Immeldrick, they were very close friends.
Right.
And they had no interest in fighting each other. They were just fighting because Prince Snorri Halfhand got a lot of the dwarves stirred up, and especially after the Ambassador incident, which really kicked off the war, where the High Elves basically started it. You have this situation where Caledor just views the dwarves as peasants, barbaric rebelliers, that just take up, they're dirty little creatures that live in holes in the dirt.
Not wrong, but yeah, I agree.
But like, Caledor loathed the dwarves.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted nothing to do with them. And when there was an opportunity for war, he took it. Because Caledor II wanted glory like his dad.
Exactly.
But Caledor II, Malekith was playing this really clever game where Malekith was hiding the true power of the Dark Elves.
Right.
Like, he kept sending out these tiny little forces that the High Elves would just get murder in Nagaroth. Like, the High Elves had a settlement on the continent of Nagaroth and were like moseying wherever they wanted because they thought Malekith was dying out.
Yeah.
There were even rumors that Malekith had died.
Exactly. Like, the High Elves were living it up.
Yeah, and that's Malekith had inserted spies into Ulthuan, whose job was to just be like, oh yeah, the Dark Elves aren't a threat.
Mm-hmm.
So he was just Calor II was just aching for this fight. But the natives who lived, the actual colonists of the High Elf colonies in the Old World, they didn't want to fight the dwarves.
Yeah.
And so that's why this war was so long, was that it started off really like, we don't really want to fight each other. But then atrocities started happening.
Yeah, it's really like... Oh, go ahead, sorry.
You had situations where Prince Snorri Halfhand was doing some horrible things to achieve victory, and he hated the elves, and he was all too happy to do anything he could to, if they would find an elven city, they would rip it apart stone by stone. He would destroy their temples. He would burn their sacred forest just to piss them off.
Exactly. And then they were doing that during the siege too. They were burning the forest because it's like, well, if we can't down the walls, we'll just burn the forest to piss them off.
Toralessi suffered.
Yeah.
Because it survived a lot of sieges, but the dwarves would always be like, oh, we can't actually take the city? Well, fine. We'll just destroy all this other stuff you have not hidden behind those walls.
Exactly.
And then the High Elves started doing it back to them. When the dragons got involved, the dragons exterminated the hill dwarves because the hill dwarves didn't live in mountains and have literal mountain sides for their walls. They were built underneath these hills, so the dragons would just come down, rip open the hills, and just vomit fire in and kill everyone.
Yeah, they were completely razing each other's settlements to the ground. And it's important to note that, like, Marienburg is, it's got the most convoluted, long-ass name in the world, the elf name for it, but that's the home of the Sea Elves. And like you were saying earlier, that this is... throughout the majority of the old world, you have all these dwarf major cities and locations. And really this is what that is. The War of the Beard is them just destroying each and every one of their settlements as the war heats up more and more and more. Because the first one's like, oh, I'm going to attack this little side settlement and I'm going to get my revenge one way or the other, depending on which faction's doing it. So I think what's really interesting about the War of the Beard is that it has caused like such an interesting schism between people that are fans of the lore and people that are like diehard elf fans and diehard dwarf fans. And it's really like the intention of it was to, as from a narrative standpoint, was to show that why these races are no longer superpowers and how Malekith played like the ultimate long game, right? And saying that, oh yeah, no, we're going to hide here in the shadows and everyone's going to think that we're no longer exist. And the impetus Calor II is just going to go spite his nose to spite his face, as they say. But,
oh yeah, and it was masterfully orchestrated. Like you don't have to like Malekith. A lot of people think he's like a whiny baby and stuff like that, or which he is many of those things.
Yes, absolutely.
Overall, but he is a hell of a schemer.
Yeah.
But do you have any other elf notes to make before we move on to the dwarf side?
I was just going to say, let's just close up the elf side. So I guess the result then of the War of the Beard for the elves, on again like a 2-3 sentence synopsis or summary, is that Calor II is killed by High King Gotrek. They take the Phoenix Crown and they head back to Karazak Karak. And the whole situation there is like, okay, well, we're going to go siege Karazak Karak and take back the helmet, the Phoenix Crown. And that's when Malekith springs and says, aha, I'm here, and attacks Ulthuan. And Caradriel, the successor to Calor II, the next Phoenix King, recalls all of the elves from the old world colonies back. And
he was just like, nah, we don't care. Like, come home. Yeah, it's time to come home.
Yeah, this ground out our navy, this ground out our army. It's time to have everyone back home, and then we'll move out if we need to from there. And that's where birth of the Wood Elves is.
Yeah, fun fact. I was literally about to say that. Yeah, it's like that's when the Wood Elves were created. Exactly. Is that Athel Loren was like, hey, y'all belong to us now.
Yeah. Where the Wold Root still connects over to Aberlore, and we need to make sure this is intact. We're staying here. So that is the result for the High Elves. Now, strengths, natural advantages, disadvantages for the dwarfs. What do you say, Mighty Sotek?
So my biggest thing would be that, so for disadvantages, we kind of touched on this with the High Elf strengths, but no monsters, no cavalry, no navy.
Right.
No air force. That seems really bad. But what the dwarves did have was they were on their home the entire war.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was through their cave systems, it was through their hills, it was through the majority of their fights. We talk about the Toralessi, like the great sieges of Toralessi, and how it is a huge centerpiece of the War of the Beard. But like we were saying earlier, there are 3-4 big sieges into Karak Azul, Karak Azul. They tried to siege Karaz Karak, but that didn't really happen. That really didn't happen. But
yeah,
far more Karaks are under siege than Tors.
Yeah, and all of the Karaks, not a single one of them fell.
Right.
You know, all the Karaks remained strong. Every single High Elf city that was attacked, except for Toralessi, got annihilated.
Right.
Some of them it took a few times, but and even Toralessi itself, in the end, was abandoned.
Right.
You know, its walls were broken, and the Dark Elves were attacking, and they were like, "We can't stay here."
Yeah, there's no reason to defend this.
And especially because with the dwarves and the High Elves licking their wounds, you know who really won the war was the Beastmen.
Yes.
The old war. They came flooding back in. And humans. Humans also won in the end, because if that war hadn't happened, then the humans wouldn't have been able to fill in the space.
Exactly.
But because
it was a power vacuum. Huge power vacuum. And Skaven and Greenskin and Skaven, who then ended up attacking the dwarves. Well, I got ahead of myself. Sorry.
Right.
We'll talk about that later.
So, and that is something I guess we could talk about as a major weakness, even though it doesn't really come into this. But we'll mention it. But it happens after the war, so it's different.
Right.
There's a series of wars called the Goblin Wars, and it led to something called the Time of Woes, which is, so the dwarves have this big old war that is devastating for them. All the Scarmanari are wiped out. They lost their best trading partner, which was the High Elves.
Right.
And they're crippled militarily, financially, economically, as far as like having resources of food or like enough stuff like that. But they're battle hardened.
Right.
But then the earthquakes come, because the Slaanen move the continents, which causes a Skaven doomsday weapon to blow up, which moved the continents even more. And that caused the old war, a fault line that basically runs through the Dwarf Empire, to shift. And that causes the Dwarf Empire, which is mostly underground, to suffer horrible disasters, earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, which if you're underground are like billion times worse than they are above ground.
Sandbags won't save you down here.
And the Dwarf's Empire, which during the High Elf, or the War of the Beard, or the War of Vengeance, which I'll call it for this segment.
We're on the Dwarf set part, War of Vengeance.
You know, the War of Vengeance, the dwarves in their actual homes of the Karak Encore were untouchable. You know, the High Elves could not get them.
Right.
But suddenly their empire just broke open. You know, you had walls that had been standing for thousands of years without anyone getting through them, now having 30-foot gaps, you know, that trolls and goblins and greenskins were just flooding through. And the underway...
About to just say the underway is now broken down.
Yep, the underway, certain sections have been flooded or filled with lava or collapsed in on themselves. Or, quite frankly, you know, the underway was also impenetrable during the War of Vengeance, but now it had cracks in it that the Skaven were able to come up through.
Right.
And so the dwarves, because they were so wounded already, then they also suffered from the natural disasters, and then their empire, they lost half of their empire in a matter of decades.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. Like, you read the book Grudge Bearer, right? And that kind of chronicles a big segment of them talking about the underway. You know, they kind of go into the underway, almost like when you're playing Dragon Ages. There's a similar underway in that, and it's like this forlorn, just ruined, decadent portion of a past that used to be just this grand empire, and that's what allowed the dwarfs to be so systematically connected, was this underway. And now this is like the great road system of Rome being completely shut down, right? Like, you now have holds that are completely cut off, lost holds north and south of Karak. And this becomes the blueprint for the dwarves, right? You really kind of look at this as like, yeah, they didn't have gunpowder just yet, but then this kind of spiraled into gunpowder, becoming a big advantage for them. But I will say a big, huge advantage too for the dwarfs is, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, is their battle hardness. They're overly tenacious in ways that elves aren't. The elves would remark about how the dwarfs are fighting to the last man, and the elves would make quote unquote tactical retreats to try and reconsolidate forces, whereas the dwarfs would just hunt them down. A lot of the scarier names that they have for some of the big dwarf heroes, like what's his name, Brock Stonefist, where it's like Lord of the Tunnels or Shadowy One of the Earth, because it's like when you go to fight the dwarfs, you are getting a very tenacious enemy that is going to just constantly come back in your face, and that's why Torlesi is sieged 14 times. The High Elves wouldn't siege anything more than twice. Like,
yeah,
and that I think is an overwhelming advantage. And on top of it, you have the best smiths in the world. Sure, there's Val's Anvil, and High Elves are great at enchanting weapons, but and they learned a lot of High Elves and dwarfs taught each other a lot about enchantments, both magically and from a runic standpoint. But no one talks about how the Gromril plate of the High Elves or anything like that. They talk about the fantastically like overdone artwork almost of the armors and the weapons that are created by the dwarfs that then go on to influence the rune fangs and the Galmaraz and all these amazing things for the Empire. It's like you have that smithing capability, I would argue, is even better at this time in the War of Vengeance than it is when humans come to prominence. Because absolutely. Yeah, exactly, because the dwarf empire is at its height, and on top of it, it's closer to the time in which the ancient gods were around, the ancient ones, ancestor gods, thank you, were around, so people are a little bit more fresh with their knowledge that they've learned from them. So you have,
and it's because dwarves are notoriously bad at passing down knowledge.
It's very diminishes over time.
Yeah, because they have this really bad habit of a lot of the longbeards of dwarf society feel they should only pass down knowledge to somebody that they think is worthy of it. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, they run into a habit of they tend to die before they find somebody worthy.
Right.
So they take those secrets with them to the grave.
Those are old curmudgeons.
Yeah. But absolutely agree with everything Italian said there. And, we also talked about the underway earlier, which that is actually a bigger deal than a lot of people may think, because the reason the dwarf Carracks were impregnable was not because their defenses were so amazing that no one could beat them. It was because the High Elves would attack a Carrack, which granted, dragons were not great against those because they were designed to deal with monsters.
Right.
Dwarves had grown up their entire existence fighting dragons and giants and trolls and all these other horrible things. And so, you'd have these lines, just walls lined with bolt throwers and grudge throwers and all this stuff. But the thing about the underway was the elves had, where the dwarves couldn't fight in the air or at sea, the dwarves were unstoppable underground.
Correct, yeah.
And so what would happen is the elves would lay siege to a Carrack thinking that, it's got 2,000 defenders or 100,000 defenders, whatever you want to say. But the problem is every single other Carrack would they'd send out these messengers who could run forever. Like, they weren't as fast as an elf runner, but they could run a lot longer than an elf runner, right? Because dwarves have so much more endurance. And they would immediately, every single Carrack would just launch their entire army underground to reinforce the Carrack from within. So you'd be fighting a Carrack and all of a sudden its garrison would quadruple in size and you would have no idea. It's like this army would just show up and all of a sudden the attackers are outnumbered and the dwarves would just come out and start beating the tar out.
Which was a common occurrence.
Yes. And the dwarves fought dirty once the war really got into it. Like, the way Brock Stonefist got his name of the Lord of the Tunnels is that he would set up traps on roads that the elves were using. And what he would do is he'd wait for an elf army to pass overhead and then set off charges that would cause the elves to fall into the road. And then the dwarves would come out from every direction and kill them. So, he would literally be sapping not walls, but roads themselves to kill the entire armies. And that's why he had such an ugly relationship with Lord Salindor, was that he did that to Lord Salindor's armies a bunch, and it would make him enraged because of how ugly of a tactic it was.
Dishonorable.
Yeah, at least from an elven perspective.
Exactly. But it's the only perspective that matters.
But, of course, the other notable strengths is that the dwarves, funny enough, because they were not known for this later on, but the dwarves adapted very quickly in the war. Like during the early war, it is not at all an exaggeration to see the dwarves were losing.
Yes.
When the dragons showed up in mass, it was bad. Like all the hill dwarves got wiped out, and the dwarves realized we can't fight this as an open battle. We have to fight. We have to use ugly tactics like underground warfare or ambushing with war machines and stuff like that. And so rune magic became almost designed just to deal with elves. We started seeing the creation of runes that had so much hatred poured into them that had never been created before because the dwarves were so angry. And this resulted in the creation of runes that even now are legendary for how deadly they are. They have no practical purpose other than to cause murder. Which dwarves weren't too big on before the War of Vengeance.
100%. So you're basically saying that the dwarfs become disciples of Khorne, right?
Yeah, they kind of abandoned some of their honor, in the name of vengeance.
And I think
which fits dwarven culture.
But
they're much more about vengeance than justice.
And it really, I'd say, does the same for the high elves. Like you have high elves reacting irrationally, more above their supposed rational selves, pushing themselves into engagements. A good
example of that. So the reason the dragons left the war was that some people may think it's because the dwarves were killing a lot, and that played into it. And we'll get to how the dwarves did that. But the dwarves figured out ways to start killing the dragons, and the dragons were. You have to remember, for those listening, me and Italian know this well, that dragons in Warhammer are so amazing because they're smart.
Right.
They're very smart.
Right.
They're not beasts. They're very intelligent creatures. I mean, some of them are beasts, but that's because they're jerks, not because they're stupid. Grog the Terrible is literally Smog. Like he's just as smart as Smog, and he's not the smartest. He's more of just big, old, and mean. But the High Elf dragons were ancient, and they are very intelligent creatures. They had, because of the amazing work of Kalidor the Mage, who was the OG Kalidor, not the Phoenix King, but the one who created the Vortex. Very powerful wizard.
Dragon Tamer, yeah.
Yeah. He has the name Dragon Tamer because he basically figured out a way for the elves to communicate with the dragons. And they talk mentally to one another. And you can't ride a dragon. Well, you can, but technically you can ride a dragon through force, but it's very frowned upon in elven culture. By the time the War of Vengeance happens. And what ended up happening is that the dragons kind of looked at the war and they were like, this is a stupid war. You guys used to be allies. This is very dangerous for us. Like, we're dying and we're not fighting for any discernible good reason. Like, we're literally just fighting because you're angry at each other.
Right.
So the dragons reached a point where they said, okay, this isn't really our fight. Like, we're willing to help you defend, but we won't help you attack. Because attacking the Carracks is suicide, and we don't support this war. And this enraged Kalidor II, because he did not care for the dragons very much, because none of the dragons ever bonded with him, because he was a jerk. And so...
I only wonder why.
Yeah, so he demanded that the dragons fight for them. And one of the elves, who was a little bit more, let's say, entrepreneuring than his fellows... Now, this was a high elf, not a dark elf, but he's not a very good high elf. He had a relic, or he designed a relic that he wanted to use that would allow him to forcibly control monsters. And he used it during the siege of Barak Var to control merworms as like his showcase. And it worked, which granted, the high elves were like, oh, that's kind of...
not a big fan of that one.
Yeah, that's kind of ugly, dude. But they're merworms. Like only one of the High Elf kingdoms has like genuine super respect for merworms, and to most they're just kind of wild monsters.
Right.
Usable, but they're not like the dragon. They're not best. But then he used it on a dragon. And not only did he force a dragon to serve him, but the dragon he summoned was a scary dragon. Because it wasn't a typical high elf dragon. It was one of the dragons of the old world.
Well, the ancient ones are like asleep underneath the earth, right?
Yeah. So it was a big dragon, but the other thing was it was mean. And it was cruel. And the other dragons hated that dragon. And when they saw that the high elves were forcing it to fight for them, they said, fuck you guys, we're going home.
Yeah.
Like, we are not, this is unacceptable. So they left. And that's why dragon princes stopped being dragon princes.
Yeah, stop mounting dragons at least.
Yeah. Which, you know, in the modern age, it's more because there aren't enough dragons. But back then, it's because the dragons outright abandoned them.
Yeah, they said, we're done with that.
Yeah, because both sides were doing horrible things. And the dragons were the only ones wise enough to be like, nah, we're leaving. But anyway, but that dragon ended up playing a major reason into why the dwarves developed what we now know as cannons.
Right.
And cannons and thunderers just eviscerated dragonkind. There were a couple other devices that were invented to try and kill dragons, like the early version of gyrocopters, which ended up being more like the modern day zeppelins were created. But, another thing worth noting is that while Malekith was manipulating both sides, but there were dark elves heavily manipulating the high elves, there was actually a greater demon of Tzeentch manipulating the dwarves as well.
Okay, that one I have not heard of.
So it's covered in the trilogy.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And
the Dwarf Advantage trilogy.
Yeah, and it turns out he's a demon that really did not like Snorri Whitebeard and Malekith for killing him. But he's responsible for the lost hold of Carrick Zorn getting wiped out by the Lizardmen. He played a role in that. And then he played a role in helping with the War of Vengeance. Ultimately, Malekith is the architect, but he was best friends with Snorri Halfhand. And he played into Snorri's racism a lot. But his big triumph moment, so to speak, was that when a dwarf of, I think it was Barak Var. But there was a dwarf of Barak Var who created flying machines. But his flying machines were very scary compared to modern day because they weren't just black powder. They were powered by warpstone. Because he had engineered a way to purify warpstone so that it didn't have corruption. It was just like super powered material. But the demon used his magic to make it detonate like a bomb. So not only did he kill the engineer responsible, but all the dwarves were like, this shit is way too dangerous.
This is weapons grade plutonium. I don't want this.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was basically plutonium that backfired. It was like, you know, it was kind of like in our culture, how a lot of people talk about nuclear reactors are apparently like really like statistically very, very safe. But, you know, people are really scared of nuclear stuff.
Yeah, for a damn good reason. Yeah.
You know, it's like, oh, yeah, sure. Like we should build it because they're really like generally they're really safe if well taken care of and they generate crazy amounts of energy. But I wouldn't want to live near one just because there's that part of my head that's like, what if? You know?
And I already have no hair. I don't want to lose more. So
you don't want to lose your beard. You got to hang on to what hair.
That's my only thing left. Let me have this.
But so I guess I would say that was the big strength of the dwarf. Also, this is when the first Slayers came into existence.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Forgot about that. This is the first. This is like the beginning of like Troll Slayers and Demon Slayers and Dragon Slayers and all that action.
Yep. Because the original Slayers were people who were inspired by Grimnir's Oath.
Right.
And they ended up taking it because of the ambassadors who had all their beards shaved by the elves. They all became Slayers.
Right.
Then a number of people who were manipulated or lost in certain circumstances ended up becoming Slayers. In fact, I believe the head ambassador who had his beard shaved was the one who became a demon slayer by killing the greater demon of Tzeentch.
I don't know about him becoming a demon slayer, because I have not read that far into that series, but I do know, yes, he becomes a slayer for sure. He's so ashamed.
Which great trilogy, by the way, for anyone that wants to read it. You can pick it up as the War of Vengeance Omnibus from Games Workshop now, and it's great.
Warhammer Chronicles.
But I would say ultimately, the thing for the strength for the dwarves is while the elves were basically losing technology throughout the war because the dragons abandoned them and some other shenanigans happened because, like, you know, they lost more access to, you know, they lost their flying advantage. They still had like eagles and griffins, but that was it. And so the dwarves were gaining tech throughout the war, whilst the high elves tended to kind of be losing it. Mm-hmm. And the dwarves were fighting on home territory. The dwarves had protected march routes and trade routes between holds, and dwarven, as you were saying earlier, dwarven fighting style was totally alien to the elves. The dwarves were familiar with how the elves fought in that they were very skilled. They used cav and monsters, but those were things the dwarves had seen before. The elves had never fought anything like the dwarves before.
They didn't know what a horse was. No, I'm just kidding.
When the elves would shoot at the dwarves, they were used to fighting beastmen and Norskins and all this stuff where they would shoot a volley and it would cause panic. The dwarves, even if it killed some of them, they would just keep coming.
Right, exactly.
But and then of course they killed the High King or the Phoenix King.
Yeah. And then on that, I guess, is a good point to kind of wrap this portion up. Talking about, we've kind of gone through about the outcome of the war for the dwarfs, for the war of vengeance for them, and how it really starts the time of woes, and how the collapse of the underway begins, and the earthquakes and volcanic activity. Basically, we get the full collapse of what makes the Kara's Encore so strong. And you get this huge isolation from all these other realms, like the northern Norscan dwarfs, quote unquote, as they're called, the ice dwarfs. They get completely cut off. All the ones in the Southlands get cut off. Like,
yep, I love that.
The ice dwarfs, you like that? Sure to have Lion Witch in the wardrobe. But basically, the result is a completely diminished dwarf empire that continues to diminish throughout the many years of the time of woes. I mean, it's like 3 generations or so span the War of Vengeance, and
they never really bounce back from it.
Yeah, they don't, and both sides don't. No one, the High Elves completely abandon all of their outposts throughout the old world, and the dwarfs end up having to abandon a lot of Karaz, or a lot of Karax, not Karaz, a lot of Karax,
which let back in the Beastmen and the Greenskins and all sorts of other nasty
Skaven. Oh my! So, at that, guys, we want to hear what you think in the comments. Who do you think won the War of the Beard? Do you think it was the High Elves? Do you think it was the dwarfs, considering the state of their, I guess, society now, maybe, or slightly after, or whatever you want to judge as your, I guess...
Yeah, give us your reason. Don't just say who won.
Yeah,
give us your reason.
Gotta be the dwarfs. Like, no, let us know why you think it was the dwarfs. Let us know why you think it was the High Elves. So, put that in the comments below. We'll do a poll later, and you guys can vote on that. But to close out our podcast here, we're aiming to have these around an hour long. This one's going to go a little bit longer. But we want to talk about the thing that's on a lot of people's mind. We'll talk about the Luminath Realm Lords next episode, because hopefully there'll be more stuff revealed by then. But we want to talk about Warhammer the Old World. Now, there was an update that came out today that showed us the map of the Old World for the most part. It covered the Southern Realms, it covered Norska, it pretty much covered the Total War Warhammer 1 map, almost like to the T. And in that, a lot of people are saying, hey, this is definitely the Age of 3 Emperors. And Sotek and I were kind of talking about this beforehand, but my overall stance on this, and I'll let you kind of weigh in on it, Sotek, is that this is going to mirror what Games Workshop has done with Warhammer 30,000 and Warhammer 40,000. And if this is your first time hearing this from me, Warhammer 30,000 is the Forge World efforts or initiative wherein they bring to life a lot of the units, a lot of the campaigns, a lot of the big things of the Horus Heresy in the 31st millennium, 32nd millennium, I guess. And then those become supplements, more or less, to Warhammer 40k 8th edition. You can use a lot of the dreadnoughts, a lot of the cataphracti armor terminators that come out and stuff like that. And they've said that Warhammer Old World is going to be very similar to 30k in Forge World. So my opinion is that, or speculation, is that Warhammer the Old World will be just like that. We'll have a lot of vignettes that dive into this quote-unquote Age of 3 Emperors, which I don't think it is. The War of Vengeance, or War of the Beard, whatever you want to take a look at. The formation of the Southern Realms, the formation of the Empire, the formation of Bretonnia, all of these little individual portions, which I then will have supplemental models and rules released that can then be brought into Age of Sigmar. What are your thoughts on that debate?
So we definitely know for a fact that Forge World is headlining what's happening. They've pretty much flat out said that as of this most recent post, and that they're at least doing all the artwork for it, which is good because, quite frankly, owning various Forge World books versus Games Workshop books, Forge World is always much higher quality.
And it's all the old artists too. All the new artists are kind of like the Age of Sigmar, very clean style art of 8th edition 40k and Age of Sigmar versus Forge World's all that gritty, like grim dark art, which I really appreciate more.
Yeah, and like the new map is beautiful. Something I actually find really interesting about it, which this may just be a case because they're showing it to us now and they're not done with it yet, but I'm not sure if that's the case. But something I kind of want to draw attention to looking at it is if you note, although it covers more space than this, it looks like they're laser focusing on some specific areas based on what they've listed. Because if you look, you'll notice that the only places that are super well detailed are basically the Dwarven Realms, the Empire,
Right.
Norska is very detailed.
Yeah.
Kislev, and Bretonia.
Yes.
Everything else is completely like it's drawn accurately and beautifully, but none of it's labeled.
Yeah,
as if
Tilia,
it's not
Stalia, Southlands, all that.
Yeah, and even Albion's back.
Yeah. Not labeled though.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if they're kind of showing what they're gonna start focusing on. It almost looks like it's gonna be like a Realms of Men feature as the starting point. Now, the other thing worth noting is that they did release a video alongside it, and the reason a lot of people are saying Time of the Three Emperors is because during the video, 4 icons come up that are basically showing the flags of certain places provinces with a name under them.
Right.
And some of the names remind people of those who bidded for the throne during the Time of the Three Emperors, which TLDR was a time when it was a big Empire Civil War where a bunch of people were saying they were emperor and someone else was playing the Uno reverse card and stuff like that.
No, I'm emperor. I'm a wolf emperor, in fact.
And it was a very important time. But I agree with ItalianSpartacus that I do not believe that that's what they're going to be doing, is featuring it as like the main thing, just because it literally was only about the Empire until Vlad showed up, and then it turned into the Vampire Wars.
Exactly. It intersects and becomes like Magnus the Pious is the ruler after it, is the emperor after all of it.
Yeah, but I genuinely think that because Age of Sigmar is doing really well, and other Warhammer IPs are doing very well, like Vermintide and Total War Warhammer and such, I think the goal of the old Warhammer, the Old World, is to bring back a feature on the things that Age of Sigmar can't continue. So bringing back really famous characters and stuff like that. As now, it could be that they release campaign supplements that are like, hey, here are rules to take you through really important times, like maybe the Time of the Three Emperors or the Vampire Wars or the Black Plague or the founding of the Empire or the rise of Morcar the Everchosen or whatever.
Right.
But I don't think that's going to be the main focus. I think the main focus is just going to be expanding what because 8th edition from a lore point was very messy.
Yes. It retconned 7th edition.
Yeah, and if there's one thing that Forge World has been doing lately is that for those of you who are worried, it's not the old Forge World. Forge World gets babysit a lot now by Games Workshop. Like, if you look at the way their rules and stuff work now, the models they make actually like are designed with rules in mind, and like Games Workshop heavily keeps track of everything. It's not like it used to be where they could just put out wherever they want and it either wasn't viable in the game or was just like grossly overpowered or garbage or whatever. Because I know that's a fear for a lot of people, is they think 30K and they're like, oh, that's like a wholly different thing that is like super niche. I don't think that's necessarily the route that's going to be happening, but obviously we don't know a lot yet. I will say though, this is a much earlier update than I was expecting.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to, I think, Churn about this, or you even, if it kind of follows the same timeline as Sisters of Battle, wherein they announced it at around the same timeline. It took about 2 to 3 years until we actually saw it took about 1.5 years to get consistent Sisters Bulletin updates, and then it took about 2 to 3 years for it to actually completely release. So
it would be nice though to have a play-by-play. Plus, on another hand, that would actually allow them to gauge people's reactions to like be able to make small shifts in their decision making based on how people react.
Right.
But yeah, ultimately, I don't know. I will say that it's easily the most beautifully rendered map we've ever had of the Old World so far, and it's very detailed considering how far out it is. Like all the Norscan tribes are freaking labeled on the map. Like I can see the Greylings. I think that's all. It's literally every single Norscan tribe labeled on the map, and like the Empire, Bretonia, like they're all very beautifully detailed.
Yeah,
I'm really curious where they're going with this.
Yeah, that's why I think, like, if you kind of look at what they've done, right? They've done, okay, well, Age of Sigmar, Free Cities. We've launched the book. You can now play as dwarfs. Well, not disavowed. What are they called?
Oh, the dispossessed.
Dispossessed. Dispossessed. You can play as the pretty much Empire. But I think what this is going to do is start to supplement into those things. Like, okay, the cities of the free cities. Well, here's a further expansion into the free cities, just like Warhammer 30K is a further expansion to Space Marine. So I think that they're going to take a look at what they've already released and said, okay, well, what does not deserve or doesn't need a full Age of Sigmar book release? Well, adding more stuff to the free cities, we've already done the rules for it. Let's just beef it up through this. And that might be how they do stuff. Is like, okay, well, the next thing we're going to cover is the War of Vengeance. This is going to add basically High Elves to your Lumineth Realm Lords, or to your Ideneth Deepkin, or to your Marathi Elves, who I can't think of the name of, or it's going to add to your Fire Slayers or your Dispossessed.
Daughters of Cain, what you were looking for.
Daughters of Cain, yeah. Like, it's going to... I could see them doing that. Like, this is a flavorful way to get additions to things. Whatever they do for Bretonia.
Huh? I wanted to zoom in on this map like 500%, and I can't, and it's frustrating me.
Hold down,
because there are some.
Hold down Control and use the mouse zoom.
Ow! Because there are some very weird little things. Now the problem is I can't read it.
Yeah, no, it pixelates it, and you're like, oh no.
Yeah, there are so many like little details. Like just calling attention to it while we're on here. If you look at the map, you can see like in the Empire, like in the what's labeled. So the red lines look like they might be trade routes, but they only have them in the Empire. So not sure what the deal is there. And then if you look like north of Altdorf, and then next to or in the Great Forest, there are these little patches that have something written each one of the patches, and I just can't see what they say.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
I don't know what those are.
Yeah, it's too pixelated for me to be able to tell. Like, that's why I can't
tell if those are villages, because the easiest thing to be able to tell like what time period this sets in is like what cities and villages are there.
Yeah, exactly.
But I can't read any of them.
It's just funny too, because you look at Bretonia and you see the Marches of Corone, you see Massive Oracle, you see the Force of Shanlon, you see Athel Loren. You don't see any cities. And same thing here.
They haven't. Yeah, which, I mean, who knows? Maybe this could take place before Bretonia is formed.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's pretty interesting. So, I think with that, we'll kind of draw things to a close. Let us know in the comment section below, guys, what you think is going to be happening with Warhammer the Old World. Hey, we're at an hour, 2 minutes. I think we made it. So look forward.
Miracle.
I know, right? Somehow we stayed on track. Who the hell knows how? Look for this in the next coming week or two to be very consistent. We're going to look at how we can put these up on other podcast things like SoundCloud and the such. I'll really kind of dive deep on that. But hopefully you guys enjoyed our first foray into Casthammer 2.0, episode 1. And we'll continue to have these going for you. And if you do have any suggestions for subjects for us to discuss, Vampire Wars, Warhammer 40,000 subjects, which we will get into, Age of Sigmar subjects we will get into, go ahead and let us know in the comments below. You can send us direct messages, whatever you
Yeah, and we'll have links in the description for like appropriate Discord channels and stuff for you to submit things.
Yeah, any like source material that we reference, like, okay, this map, the Discord, what's it called? Idea submissions, anything like that, we'll have it all in both the description and Loremaster Sotek's channel, description and the first comment on the video. But guys, with that, Sotek, any closing notes from you, big guy?
No. Hope you're all just doing well, and we look forward to seeing y'all on the regular.
Indeed. Well, guys, thanks so much for watching here today. Have a good one, and take care.